This is episode 619 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined again for a return visit by a former U.S. representative to Congress, Yvette Herrell. Welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Yvette.
Thank you for having me, Paul. I'm glad to be here. Wish it was in person, but this is the next best thing.
Well, that's okay. There's been a lot going on for both of us. It was good to see you last Monday night at the Corey DeAngelis education event in your neck of the woods, Alamogordo. And so I appreciate you coming out for that. And, we're going to talk a little bit about the forest fires and what's going on in Ruidoso. And then we're going to talk a little bit economically about what's at stake here in the November election. Of course, I guess first and foremost, you were uncontested in your primary, but congratulations for winning your primary for Congress.
Well, thank you. Yes, it was a blessing to not have to use resources or worry about that. So, ever since last April, we've really been running for November of this year.
Yeah, and that's where all eyes are turning. Of course, we have the debate coming up. We're recording this on June 25th, 2024, and it'll be released on Thursday. And that evening is when Trump and Biden will go at it for the first time in a debate this election cycle. So that should be interesting. Are you doing anything relating to that?
I'll be up in Albuquerque that day, so I'm hoping that I'm somewhere where I can at least watch that debate because I think that'll kind of set the tone for all of the candidates for the next, 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, no, it'll be a very interesting occasion. So we shall see how that goes. But on Monday, a week ago Monday, when I saw you with Corey, the fires were burning fully heated, and the plume was very large coming across on 180 there from I always get it mixed up. Is it 180 or 380? Anyway, the road from
380.
the road from the interstate over to Carrizoso. I'm one of those people that goes by landmarks when I drive anyway. So uh, and then on the way back, because we did drive back with Corey that night, I'd never seen so much traffic on that road, and I kind of realized intuitively that it was because they had actually evacuated Ruidoso at the time. Now, there's a lot of speculation currently going on about the cause of those fires, but you have done a lot of work uh, with regard to federal lands issues and the way that they are managed. And uh, just can you start with what you know and understand about the situation in Ruidoso as we sit here right now on the morning of the 25th?
Yeah, it's just so unfortunate and catastrophic. And this is their third biggest fire in the last 3 years. They had the McBride fire, and yes, there is speculation that this was arson. And I know the FBI is obviously actively investigating. I've talked to some of their guys, and it's just mind-boggling, Paul, to think that somebody could actually intentionally start a fire that would cause this much damage, not only property damage, but as I understand it from an update I received last night, I knew of two fatalities earlier last week, and I heard last night there may be more that people just could not get out or may have been stuck in their homes or their cars, and that's just so unfortunate. And to think that somebody would intentionally do such a thing is incomprehensible. But I'm grateful for just the support, the overwhelming support from the surrounding communities. I mean, Alamogordo, Roswell, Tularosa, just so many people came together, and it truly, I think, expresses the character of our communities. Just the way that we all rallied around the village of Ruidoso and Mascalero.
Yeah, now there's a lot of unknowns at this point still, and the
Yes.
fires are by no means completely out. But in your work on federal lands issues, uh, one of the things that stuck out, and I remember this because it was over a decade ago, is that the Mescalero Apache have a very good reputation in terms of the way that they actually manage those lands. Can you talk about the difference between the way certainly the federal government and the Forest Service have a reputation versus the mescaleros, and why that automatically made it kind of questionable that this occurred? Because it does seem from all news reports that those fires began on mescalero lands.
Yeah, that coupled with just the complete dryness. I mean, they just hadn't had moisture up there until obviously, thank goodness, since the fire started. But yeah, I mean, it's just obvious, Paul, when you go through the Mascalero Apache Reservation, you can see land management. Their practices are so much more superior to what we see in our own national forests. And of course, because they're sovereign, the Mascalero don't have to comply with the same rules, regulations, the Endangered Species Act, the NEPA reports, and all of these things. And we've created a tinderbox all over New Mexico by not actively managing our forests. And here's what's unfortunate. Losing our entire timber industry because of the spotted owl. Now we've created a forest that they can't even live and thrive and hunt in. So this, lack of ability to go in and safely manage our forests, especially by those communities that and the people that live in and around the public lands, that make a living from the public lands, whether it's allotments or before, the timber. And it's just a stark contrast. And in fact, the Mescalero Apache have done such an amazing job. They actually, a few years ago, were getting paid to graze cattle on their forest because you could actually see the forest floor. It really helped with the underbrush. They had a very healthy and robust forest. And again, we're seeing it all over the country with the inability to go in and actively manage and work on water conservation. All of these things that make sense for the Western states, especially because of the federal government getting in the way every single day. And it's unfortunate to see the condition of our national forests.
Yeah, so some of the things that they do, and of course, these are by no means just unique to modern mescalero practices. These are the kinds of practices that were done by Native Americans before even first contact. They thinned the forest. They would set up truly controlled burns, not the kind that the Forest Service set up in northern New Mexico a few years back. And they uh, manage the forest in a way that would prevent a lot of these kinds of uncontrolled and really hot and damaging fires, right? And
Oh,
it's something that
100%.
can't be done now, or isn't
Yeah.
done on Forest Service lands.
Yeah, we don't do it on Forest Service lands. And in fact, just a couple of years ago when I was up at the Goss Ranch on a different issue, the New Mexico mouse, the little mouse up there, the forester there told me that the reason they're not able to manage these forests like they need to be is because of two reasons. He told me the Endangered Species Act and the environmental groups. And he actually confirmed that they actually, for the first time, the U.S. Forest Service had the funding in their budget allocated to go in and manage some of these forest lands, these that we see in New Mexico and around the western states, but they're unable to do so because we're prohibited by our own government regulations, which makes no sense at all. So what we've done is we've really put a real hamstring on our watersheds. I mean, with this overgrowth, we should have about 50 tree an acre. We're seeing in some cases 200 and 300 trees per acre, so none of them are growing healthy. We're seeing so much underbrush. And of course, all of that absorbs and takes the water out of those, our watersheds that we need for crops further east. And it is absolutely stunning that we can watch our own government make policies that prohibit us from having healthy and robust forests and really access to public lands. And you've probably been by some of the forests up in the Lincoln. You can't even access, you can't walk through. There's timber on the ground. There's so much debris on the ground. And when I was in Congress, we introduced the biochar bill, that would have allowed private sector to go in and pull a lot of that debris off the forest floor and then turn it into the biochar that can be used in our ag operations and crops. And, it was a great idea. And to me, that was just such a great solution. And I worked closely with Bruce Westerman, Congressman Westerman, the chairman of Natural Resources, on that piece of legislation. And even when we come up with these really great solutions, or at least a step in the right direction, we're met with, no, we're met with not having a hearing. We're met with, we don't want to make change. And especially hurtful is thinking this is change that would benefit the people of New Mexico and the people in the western states enormously.
And the I assume that I want to make sure to let you put a finer point on it, that the opposition to these kinds of things comes from the radical environmental groups.
100%. I mean, when we're giving, just looking at the Endangered Species Act as an example, giving Mexican gray wolves that aren't even native to the state more rights than our ranchers, when now we're looking at the listing of the chipmunk up in the Lincoln National Forest, we're looking at, and it's not just the forest, it's the sand dune lizard, it's the prairie chicken, it's all of these things combined where we're, the spotted butterfly, it's just one after another after another. And what's unfortunate is we've seen firsthand, you know, thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent privately for conservation efforts by those that utilize public lands for, grazing or for energy or whatever the case may be. So it's not that there's not a willingness from private sector to conserve, but really the best stewards of our public lands are those that understand these lands and make a living off of these lands, quite honestly. And yet, their voices are pushed to the side. And of course, it's the bureaucrats in Washington and its policies, the push, even with our Senator Heinrich and even Representative Vasquez and others that want to push for more land grabs, more monuments, more designations, which pushes, the ability to utilize that federal property for allotments and other things off the table. So it's absolutely uh, not a balanced approach to correct forest management and restoration of our watersheds.
So we've talked about federal lands, we've talked about the Mescalero lands. Obviously, Ruidoso is probably going to permanently change as a village as a result of this. There's obviously some businesses, some prominent businesses, historic businesses that have been lost as a result of this. But you know, uh, individuals and the village itself, they play a role at least around the city or around the village. To me, Ruidoso's bigger than a village.
Right, right.
It certainly has like at least a city feel to it. Not a big city, but it's a beautiful little place up there in the mountains. Uh, it does seem like there might need to be reforms in the way people themselves manage uh their properties and try to fireproof it. And I know there are ways to do that. We don't need to get into all of that, but what's your take on kind of uh mountain towns and how they minimize their vulnerability to these kinds of things? Is that
Yeah.
something that private individuals have a role in?
Yeah, in fact, actually, the village of Ruidoso has a very active, a very aggressive approach in terms of private property ownership. We own property in the village. My sister lives there, and they really make sure people have their properties cleaned up. The pine needles and certain trees. I mean, they'll come in and ask you to take down trees off your private property, if your lot, if they feel like it creates a hazard. But and that's great for the village. But Paul, where sometimes it gets a little skewed is, for instance, just looking back in May when they had that fire in Ruidoso. Of course, it didn't burn any structures or anything, but it started on a wilderness designated area. And instead of taking in you know helicopters or slurry planes to start putting that out, they didn't. And of course, again, decisions are being made by people that have never even set foot in the state of New Mexico in some cases. We have our winds, we have just a crazy weather here. And of course, the climate, it's so dry, that fire got out of control. But yeah, I think the mountain communities mostly are pretty cognizant of, the threat of wildfire and that, you can only do so much. And then when you're bordering those national forests that are not managed the way they are managing some of the localized property within, say, the village city limits. It's just a recipe for disaster, and especially that fire that started last week. We heard reports, and I think you might have been there when we were hearing. It was burning up to 1,000 acres an hour, which is crazy fast, and so it just it is going to take, I think, a very long time for the village to recover. And some of these iconic businesses, I mean, the ski Alto ski shop, the Swiss Chalet, hotel that's been there forever, and just, in fact, TDS Communications, I think they lost their entire office and some of their equipment. They're saying it could be months before they can really get everything assessed and get customers back online. So it is really catastrophic. But the management, if we're going to mandate in a village that people take care of their private property within the city limits or the village limits, then I think the federal government has the responsibility to manage those federal properties that border these small, communities like Cloudcroft. I mean, Cloudcroft is very frightening to me because that forest is just so out of control right now.
Yeah, well, we will see what develops in Ruidoso, and hopefully, obviously, it's way down the list of things that people care about, but that's a good conservative area of our state. Those are people that we hope will rededicate themselves and rebuild and make Ruidoso even better than it was before, and hopefully more secure and less prone to fires and these kinds of disasters. But I'm confident that it will be a challenge because, of course, we've seen rising inflation, construction costs are off the charts, and I know insurance for homeowners has skyrocketed. I know in Florida, for example, just on the assumption because of the hurricane situation down there, uh, there's been a increase in the price of homeowners insurance, and so uh, all of these factors are going to make rebuilding very expensive and
Yeah,
challenging.
that's a real deal in Ruidoso in the not just Ruidoso, but mountain properties in general. Insurance companies aren't, the risk is too high. They're not even writing policies. And in fact, I have a friend that they were going to move to Alto actually just a couple of months ago, and the reason they did not end up buying their home is because they could not find insurance. Finally, found a company that would write for 1 year, but would not guarantee a second year of coverage, and they just felt like the risk was too high. And I'm fearful that we're going to see that play a huge role in the ability to rebuild. Because there's just so many people still displaced, and you're right, it's going to take some time, and I do hope they come back stronger than they ever were. But just the rising costs, fuel costs, the time it takes to get materials in, it's just unfortunate. And they're going to be working through this for a very, very long time, I think.
All right. Well, that was my attempt at a segue to economic concerns and issues. And of course, you're running to replace Gabe Vasquez there in Congress in southern New Mexico. And obviously, you're not the only person now, or that district is not the only, doesn't encompass all of southern New Mexico, but can you briefly describe what District 2 in New Mexico looks like?
It looks big. No, I'm kidding. It's a large district, and it's very interesting now because the way the redistricting occurred, so you have still these smaller communities like Cloudcroft and Mayhill, and just these little tiny communities, then coupled with the South Valley and then kind of the western portion of Albuquerque. So you've got a little bit more of the urban and the rural. But what I found to be very interesting is all the conversations that I'm having all over the district, whether it's from, Deming or Lordsburg or all the way up to Albuquerque. The huge concern for most of the people I'm talking to is either border, number one, border security, or economy. And, it's fascinating, Paul, is people don't need you and I to tell them that the economy isn't on track. Everybody knows we've seen a 17% uptick in the cost of living over the last 4 years, and that's not easily recoverable. That coupled with the cost of goods, services, groceries, fuel, utilities. I mean, it is taking a toll on the American job provider, the American family, the people of New Mexico, and those are real kitchen table issues that I'm hearing about all over the place. And it's interesting whether it's somewhere over on the west side of Albuquerque, or, like I said, Cloudcroft. It doesn't matter the size of the community. Everybody's kind of saying the same thing. And there's very grave concern and very real concern about all these things I mentioned. Plus, you couple that with education, the lawlessness, neighborhood safety. The state is very difficult sometimes to do business in. You've covered that forever, and you get it. These policies are not friendly. And I just saw yesterday, and you probably did too, Jim Winchester from the Independent Producers Association just put out an email yesterday talking about, environmental groups that want to bring back more policies that will really prohibit, there'll be a hit to our energy sector. So it's, and I think the one thing I'm very kind of pleased about is I feel like voters in general, I don't care the party, I think they're very much very willing to look at their own self-examination of their own pocketbook, 401, their child's education, just the area they live in, and realize, okay, party affiliation is not working. These policies, and the real killer for the American people are the rules that are being passed through, not a legislative process, but through, Department of Justice or BLM or whoever. Those rules that are impacting ag, oil, banking. I mean, those are the ones that are really hurtful as well.
Yeah, obviously energy is a huge uh, thing that the Biden administration has, I think it's safe to say, completely screwed up or done in ways that have negatively impacted average New Mexicans, average Americans. Uh, New Mexico's a pro-energy state. There's a lot of ways in which energy would be uh, better. We'd be better off if energy were managed differently. But right now, with a very narrow split in the House and not control of the Senate on the Republican side, Democrats control that. It's very tough for Congress to act. What would you see changing? And obviously, Trump was a pro-energy president. What
Yeah.
would you see? How would you see that situation going differently if you had a Republican trifecta?
Yeah, I think you'd see right away a couple things: the border secured right away, and then that movement for energy independence reestablished, because President Biden has really gutted our ability for this energy independence that we were right there. And it's also national defense, but we've got to push these costs of fuels down. We ought to be talking about building refineries in this country instead of thinking of ways to shut off the industry as a whole. It makes absolutely no sense with the jobs, the revenues, the national security that's all tied to this. Um, and these executive orders, the Keystone Pipeline, and then just not so long ago, the rule to, or the executive order to stop exporting liquid natural gas. I mean, this is jobs. This is economy. And what we've done by doing some of these things is prop up our foreign nations that are not our allies to be able to produce more energy, sell it so they can fund their wars. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. And I'm so very proud of New Mexico and the Permian Basin and other areas that have figured out ways to really, with the technologies, to produce energy in a cleaner, more affordable, efficient way. We're not holding countries around the world to the same standard, the environmental standards, as we are the United States of America. And that's why it just makes no sense that we're making these policies that are so, uh, they're almost really out of touch with what we can do. We're in some ways not even there yet, if you will. But to put these mandates on the electric vehicles and so forth, it just it just makes no sense for the rural community that has maybe one or two, if that. I mean, I don't even know who drives an electric vehicle, a fully electric vehicle in my own community. So I think what we'd see with the trifecta is right away energy independence come back full throttle. I think we would also see the border becoming secure, and I think that would position us globally in a much better position. And it also would give us, I think, the boost we need to help push down this giant inflation that we're all dealing with.
Have you taken a close look at the uh, LNG situation, liquefied natural gas? It's another opportunity where the Biden administration has essentially penalized American energy producers while also undermining our foreign policy and environmental goals. But uh, that's kind of it's kind of like the environmentalists and the fires. They claim they want to help the environment, but they would rather see forests burn than be harvested for timber or other uses for it. That's the way it seems like their approach to LNG is. Is that something you're familiar with at all?
Yeah, I mean, when he did the executive order to stop the export of LNG, I mean, not only did it impact the ability to create more jobs, but again, it just undermines everything that we stand for as the greatness in terms of our energy independence. And another thing, though, Paul, I want to bring up that not very many people talk about very often, and I think it's worthy, is, I'm an all of the above energy person, but I also am a realist, and I think traditional energy is where it's at. But what we don't talk about enough, I think, are the byproducts from petroleum fuels, the makeup, the clothes, the plastics, the medications. I mean, last time I got a report, there was over 6,000 medications that had some type of byproduct from petroleum in the medication. And you just look at all these, there are no byproducts from solar, there are no byproducts from wind, so we're not even in a place where we can, we don't even have the science yet to create the 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 medications or the plastics, the things that we're using on a day-to-day basis. I tell people all the time, if everything in a room that was touched by a petroleum product disappeared, it'd be almost a concrete slab, nothing much, because we just aren't talking enough about how vital those byproducts are to our everyday lives and how we take them for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Now, uh, I guess Argentina is a nation that's embarked on the free market reform, and I'm not expecting you to go chapter and verse about uh, Milei and his economic reforms, but apparently they had the first month without food inflation in several years down there, and it seems like um, if you are serious about these issues and you choose to restrain spending, reduce the size of government, you can actually move the needle pretty effectively and pretty quickly. And my biggest critique of Trump in his first term was that whether it was COVID or before COVID, he allowed spending to get out of control. Do you share that criticism? And do you think that we can maybe drain the swamp using fiscal restraint in a second Trump administration?
Yeah, I think things will be different. And you're right. I mean, he did spend, and I think at the time though, the economy was so good, the tax breaks were working, people were getting more money in their pockets, businesses were flourishing. I talked to a lot of businesses that had additional revenues in their coffers where they could expand or put up, towers for radio, cell towers, all those types of things, and I think that we were all kind of uh, looking the other way, with some of the spending because we were ourselves uh, doing better as a whole, as a nation, independently and economically. I absolutely think now we've seen a huge change in just the entire nation, the economy of this country, and obviously globally. And I think we're recognizing that we've got to get our ducks in a row, get ourselves back on track, but we have to do it in a really pragmatic way where we're not creating more problems. But I think if Trump comes back, we expand the House, take the Senate, I think we'll see some policy changes that will actually benefit us. But we have got to curtail the spending. And there's a lot of, this, and I do too, and the American people see it too. A lot of duplicative spending, I mean, so many bills that do the exact same thing, and we just poured money into places that should never have been. And all of this, the infrastructure bill, 3 trillion, 7 trillion, and just what 9% of that actually used for real infrastructure, roads, highways, airports, right of ways, those types of things. And it's just nobody wants to stand up and say stop. And what's sad is we've got all these young children and these generations yet to be born that have been saddled now with this reckless spending that don't even have a dog in the fight, that are going to be responsible for all of this if we don't get our fiscal house in order and start thinking about this 30, what are we, 33, 34 trillion dollars in debt. What we're doing to ourselves is unbelievable. And I do believe Americans are starting to see that their dollar, it's not worth 100 pennies anymore. It's going less and less far for them. And they see it every day with the bills they're paying. And so, yeah, we've got to get spending both sides under control and start putting the American people and the American economy first and foremost.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's something that I truly hope he is willing to do, and that you will hold him accountable if you're up in Washington. Something else economically that I think is low-hanging fruit that should be done, and I realize that uh, ultimately the president does have kind of outsized authority on this on trade, and Trump is not the most free trade president, but even somebody who's not a big believer in free trade, it's a no-brainer that the United States should create a more broad free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, with England. Now that they're out of the EU, they're independent. U.S. does have some free trade agreements with them, but this is our greatest historical ally. It seems like something that uh, would be obvious. I'm looking at a Politico story from December of 2023 that Biden quietly shelved trade pact with the UK before 2024 elections. Now, I don't know if he thinks he would get critiqued by Trump, but I am a believer in international trade. I'm not a believer that every trade policy makes sense, especially with nations like China that are hostile to America's interests in so many ways. But uh, England is obviously one of our greatest historical allies. It would seem logical that we would want to get a trade agreement going with the UK. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the trade agreements are, I think, in a lot of ways, Paul, are necessary, but we also have to ensure that all the players are held to the same standard, that we're all on the same page, and there's parity there in terms of keeping everybody held to the same standard. But we have to, and why we're not, why aren't we talking to Israel before this war broke out over there? I said it all the time. Why aren't we partnering with Israel? This isn't exactly a trade agreement, but for chips, instead of relying so much on China. But with these trade agreements where we could obviously utilize trade with our allied countries, and where we're going to need it with just to bolster the ability to produce food. I mean, we've done so much to hamper our ability to grow food and trade food. And even talking to some of the producers down in Las Cruces, they do a great deal of business across the border, but because of the value of the dollar versus the peso and the additional costs now trying to work through any of those trade agreements and trade policies, it now has added more costs to the consumer on the back end, at the grocery store. And so, I mean, I think we have to be smart in how we create these agreements. But I'm with you. Why aren't we having a better, a more robust international trade policies with some of these nations that can benefit both the United States and themselves, and vice versa?
All right. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about immigration and what's going on. After leaving the border completely open for months and months, Biden issued an executive order that, in theory, cracks down on the border, but just kind of share any updates and new kind of perspectives that you have relating to both the border from the Biden administration as well as Gabe Vasquez and his approach to the border.
Well, unfortunately, a couple of things real quick. What President Biden's trying to do now is way too little too late. And let's just be very, very clear. No one that I've met and no one I've talked to is concerned about the migrant who came here, has been in this country for at least 10 years, and is married to an American citizen. Like, they're not on the radar. Those are not the people that I think are out looting or murdering people. I mean, those are not the people that we're concerned about. With this wide open border that has created not only a ginormous cost to the American people, for transportation, housing, medication, all of these things. And now I'm seeing in Colorado, Denver, they're actually laying off people that are actually employed by the city so they can hire illegals to try to curtail. This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. But a wide open border is an absolute chaotic scene, and it is a national security threat. And we've seen it over and over, the lawlessness, the the people being poisoned by the fentanyl flowing across the border, the murders that are happening to innocent victims all over the country. There was just another one, a 12-year-old girl, last week. I mean, that's the kind of stuff people in New Mexico are talking about when we're having to close down schools because migrants are hiding in schools over in Santa Teresa. That has never happened before. And Gabe has been silent on all of it. And something I want to make very clear that no one is talking about enough. Now it's close to the election, and the Republicans don't want to do anything for the border. They don't want to work with Democrats to pass policy. Let's just back this up a bit. Even in the minority, we had a number of bills that were introduced: Remain in Mexico, keep Title 42 in play. We had all these things going on. Pelosi would never bring them to the floor. Fast forward, when the Republicans had the majority, the very first bill they brought to the U.S. House floor was the Border Security Act, which was really the most comprehensive border security policy that's ever been introduced. Every single Democrat in the House voted no, and the Senate has never taken it up. So, there have been ways that these things could have been fixed. There are ways these things could have been addressed, but that's not what's happening. And then Gabe, with all his wisdom, actually took a reporter down to the border from the Wall Street Journal, the stories out there just 2 weeks ago, and showed her the crossing that, he's held her. Republicans think this is a place where migrants are crossing. There's nothing to see here. And while they're there, 20 military age migrants crossed the border with one young lady. I mean, that happened right. I mean, you couldn't have planned that, so to think that this is, not happening is a joke. And people's lives are at stake, and our American sovereignty and our American safety is very much at stake with this open border policy. And look, there's been Remain in Mexico. There's been bills introduced to put more boots on the ground, to deport illegals that kill police officers, to deport those that have come here and committed crimes, to deport those that have had a criminal background. And yet here we are, all the Democrats voting no on these policies that could actually help preserve Americans' freedom and American safety.
Right. Well, any last things? Why don't you give out your campaign website, if you would, Yvette? And I appreciate your time today.
Oh, I love being on with you, Paul. Yes, it's just YvetteHerrell.com, YvetteHerrell.com. Go online, go to our website, sign up for our newsletters. If you want to get involved, obviously, we'd love to have your help, whether it's with prayer or knocking doors or volunteering and phones or whatever. This is, I think, one of the most consequential elections we'll see in our lifetime. There's a lot at stake. And, what I'm thinking and what I'm saying and what I'm hearing is party affiliation is not what's important right now. It's the people, it's the policies, and it's the relationships that are going to be made through this process so we can take our country back and start getting it back on track. We all miss the America we grew up in, and we have an opportunity to change things in November, and I hope people will keep praying about it and get out and vote.
All right. Thank you, Yvette Herrell, and good luck in your run for Congress. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.